Okay, let's just have a go through the this oil system on this 750 Honda, and we'll have a look at what we've done to try and change things. So what I've got here is an original 750. It's another VF oil pump. Yeah, it's still a good pump, all the lot, but I've just taken the 3 bolts out the cover. But what I want to do is, first off, is just discuss a couple of bits about what's going on. It's quite a simple circuit actually in this V4. So, but there's two. When I say 2 circuits, they're all the same circuit, but let's call them 2 circuits for the minute, for the purpose of just going through it. Okay. So we've got basically here, where my finger is here, this is suction. So the oil pump being driven by the back of the clutch, by the back of the primary drive gear, turns the oil pump. Okay, so turning the oil pump, now oil enters the oil pump in one side of the pump. The actual chamber that the oil in, as it's rotating, becomes smaller, so the oil is, again, we all know we can't compress a liquid, so as the pump is rotating, the chamber the oil is in is becoming smaller as it moves round, so the oil has to go somewhere. So as it rotates over the top, the oil goes into the other side, essentially, the other side. Okay, and if the camera, just let me check this camera what you're seeing. So it exits the pump here. As it exits the pump there, it then goes along that tube we've seen in the first few videos of the engine, back up into the cases. There's an O-ring on here. This is part of the cast cases, but let's just look at the chamber. It's pressurized now in here. So in here, Honda's figures are 70, let's call it 87. Well, I don't know, let's call it 80, middle of the road. We've got our 80 psi in here, which means, without getting technical now on fluid dynamics, if there's 80 psi there, there's 80 psi there. Yeah, there's 80 psi everywhere. There's 80 psi there, and there's 80 psi through the pressurized circuit after post filter. Before we get that far, let's look at our 80 psi here. Now, the oil pump is turned from 1000 RPM to, what is it, 10? Is it 10,000 RPM? Okay, at 1000 RPM it has to produce, it's got to produce, I would say minimum of, we will find figures on this because we're going to put an oil pressure gauge on when it's running, but I don't know, tick over, it's got to be kind of 20, all figures, let's call it all figures in PS, it's got to be 20 at tick over. I wouldn't have thought we'd be looking at anything less than 20. And we are guessing at the minute, I know, but we're talking hypothetically, but 1000 at 20, so 10,000 20, so 10 times more on there, another 10. So at 10,000 revs would be at 200 psi. If it was like for like, would be at 200. That can't happen. This filter would have popped by 200 psi. Because it's a fixed drive to the oil pump, it's a fixed chain driven drive from the back of the clutch down to the oil pump. It's fixed. So if 1000, do you get the point I'm making? So what do we have? We have here a little oil pressure relief valve. Now all it is a ball bearing on a spring. Okay, actually it springs that side, you dummy. Right, springs that side on a ball bearing. Okay, as pressure is being introduced in this chamber, Honda's preset wisdom has set the preload on this spring at, let's just call it X. Okay, we don't know what it is until we put a scope on it, but we will know when I get the oscilloscope video up. But let's call it X. Honda have set the preload on this spring and ball bearing at X. Now the oil is in this chamber here as well. If it's in here, it's in here, it's in here, and the filter everywhere, it's in here. But the only way we can control this, we need something to give. We need somebody to open a tap up. Now, back to the beginning. If we want, say, 80 psi, if we wanted 80 psi at 10,000 revs, we'd be down at 8 at 1,000, which wouldn't be enough. Do you get the point I'm making here with this? Why won't that rub off now? Permanent, yeah. Okay, so back to this. So what they do, they put in a pressure relief valve. So 80 psi in here everywhere, pressing on this ball. As soon as the pressure in here rises to a point that the spring can no longer contain, the ball lifts with the oil pressure. So, and there's little holes in it, so out comes some oil pressure, just sprays out inside the sump. Once the RPM drops down lower and the engine speed slows down and we start to become lower than 80, the ball would shut. As soon as we come down to 80 again, the ball would sit back on its seat by the spring and maintain it. So all that's doing is maintaining 80 psi. Okay, so with that in mind, we've got 80 psi. Now, are you with me when I say it is 80 psi in here? And let's look at this. Take the cover off the pump. Let me see what you're seeing again. So, here's our oil pump. Okay. Now, I don't know how much I'm going to be able to show in here, but in fact, let me take it off here and it'll be easier for me to do it like this. There's the drive shaft, obviously, here. Now, in there, in fact, wait a minute, let's just take that out as well. The drive shaft, I'm going to put there. There's the little shim on the back. He's going back on. And what we have is a very clever system. What we have is, these are usually sharp as hell, but anyway, out it comes. Right, so we can see in the chamber now in here, inside the oil. So in here is this suction into this side of the chamber. So it starts, well, it's suction into this side and across, there's only two sides to it, across the chamber to this side. When it's pressurising into this side. So, can you see down there? Can you see down there? That is this little, where this little dowel is. Just bear with me, because I'm going to see if I've got, never have got a screwdriver to hand. Down here is down here, okay? So that there, where that marker pen is in this hole. So, back to the basics here. When this oil pump is drawn in, so let's just look at the function. Okay, it rotates round, and these star shape, if you like, rotate round in both chambers. So when we introduce this side, just bear with me while I get that back in. It's all going to fall to bits in it. Hang on. Right, got him. So, rotating. If you look at the oil pump from, let's mark it up, from here, from our red dot. See our red dot there? Okay. If you look at the chamber here underneath the red dot, as it rotates, this chamber is getting bigger. Forget this here and this here for the minute, just look at this one. As it's rotating round, in the cavity behind it that we looked at, where the oil comes in, this is getting bigger, becoming bigger all the time to there, till it changes from that to that. So what happens there in the engine is atmospheric pressure is actually having an effect on the oil in the sump. So because that's opening up, what's really happening is, atmospheric pressure pushes the oil up here and into this chamber, but we'll call it suction. And every time that happens, every one of these, let's just concentrate this side for the minute, every time that happens we get a chamber full of oil, another chamber there full of oil, another chamber full of oil, and it's quite a bit, there'll be quite a bit in there. So it creates a low pressure environment that oil enters this chamber. Okay, now then, what happens now is we now have a chamber full of oil, and we now have a chamber full of oil there. So we see that. We'll just see if we can see that clearly. We see that here now. There's a chamber full of oil here, and as I move round, there's another one there. So as it's moving around now, we've got that amount of oil there captured. There's the aluminium housing behind it, so it's now captured with the cover on. At that point there, at that point, at that point there, when it's on there, so the oil is now captured in this bit. Keep rotating. It now, just inside there, it's just opened this cavity in this side, because as it's just opened it, we're getting smaller. So what was in there now, we all know we can't compress a liquid, as we've said. Now what's happening is it's squeezing what was in that chamber into this chamber here. Again, there's another one gone, another one gone, another one gone, and another one gone, like that. So all the time it's picking it up from here, capturing it at the top, and then squeezing the shape again and putting it into this side, which means now it forces it into this chamber. If this chamber was closed, it would just pressurise that amount in there and it would either stall or, but anyway, forget that train of thought. What we're talking about is it goes into this chamber here, and in that chamber there is our outlet there for the cams. So that's the outlet. There's the chamber again, forcing. I've got my torch. Yes, just wait for a second. I know you should be ready. You see in there now? That chamber. In there. I'm holding the torch with my chin, and that's why I'm talking like a goon. So, picks it up from there, brings it across the top, and forces it into this side. Okay, so there you go. I hear you say, but it's just the cans. Right, we'll have a look on the cover. As we look at the cover, and the cover goes on that way, this chamber here is also, this side of it is also this chamber. So not only does it go out there, but it goes out there. So let's just go back to that. We now know it's coming out here and here at the same time. The pump has dragged it across the top and squeezed it into both of these. Now both of these are the same place, just two different exits. So I mean, I'm hoping you follow that with me now. So what I'm actually trying to say here is, if we've got 80 psi in here controlled by this oil pressure relief valve, we've got 80 psi in here too, because it's the same. If we teed off there and put it there, it's the same thing. The only difference is the bore size. So the flow would be higher, but pressure is remaining the same. The flow is lower there, higher there. Lower pressure, lower, excuse me confusing it, lower flow, same pressure. 80 psi in there. Okay, so with that in mind, this side of the pump, remember, is pressurized, held at 80 by the pressure relief valve. But this side here hasn't gone through the filter. This side has just been picked up from the pump sump into the pump, around the pump, and then up to, let's call it bad feed. The bad feed, because we know it is. Right, in itself, that's not perfect. The fact that it's picked oil up and it's pumped it to this side, forget this for the minute, pumped it this side and out to a working components. These working components are our camshafts. Okay. Also, the working components it's feeding is the selector drum and selectors, which is this selector fork, and the bearings in the gearbox shafts. Now, it's not picking oil up from gearbox shafts. You have to remember it's picked up from the sump. All it's done is it's pressurised oil out two ways of the same chamber, just two ports out of the same place. You know, you could, in this, if this makes sense, you could drill and tap a hole in here and have a third one, because it's all this side chamber that's pressure. So with that in mind, yes, it's not ideal because it's not been filtered before it goes to the cans, but if you try and imagine the amount of times this has happened in a minute, the oil in essence that goes up there will, the previous time round, say, been through there. And Motor Guzzi do it that way with certain big block V twins. They only filter some of the flow. And what we're talking about here is, not relying isn't the right word, but we're talking about eventually all the oil does get filtered. I mean, it's not that this is picking up from a separate chamber that's never filtered. This is picking up from, when the oils all fell back down, this is picking up from the sump that everything's had. So after it's been through there and to the crank and dropped to the bottom, what's to say that that bit of oil that's been filtered there and gone up to the crank and dropped to the bottom gets picked up, doesn't, that very blob of oil hasn't gone up to the cams. If you get what I'm trying to say, it is being filtered. But ideally, in an ideal world, you would filter all of it. Now, Honda in their wisdom decided, because this is towards the back of the gearbox, that they would just, tell you what, instead of getting another complicated gallery coming from the front of the engine here and trying to find a way to get it back to the wheel pump, that's essentially what's gone on. Okay, so just to reiterate what we're talking about here, so we've got the oil pump turning that way. Actually, the engine's running, so we've got 80 psi in here and 80 psi in here. That pressure in that line is still governed by this oil pressure relief valve. This pressure here is still governed by him. So, what then, he says, what then, just get something that's on this bit of tissue, what if this line here, okay, this line here is our bad feed, we're calling it. Okay, this is where the banjo bolt is. The banjo bolt is here in the back of the gearbox. Okay, everyone with me with that? Yeah, that's where the banjo bolt is. Then it's our external. Where is he? Our external oil line. Okay, so what they've done is Honda said, well, instead of trying to get a complex sort of, I don't know, we'll just take it out the back of the pump. It's close to the gearbox. We've got a little small, if you look at the earlier videos, you can actually see where it goes on and the little chamber that's in the cases that this feeds into. So what if now, as I've just done here, we remove this red feed to the cams and block it off? If we remove this red feed, this feed that I drew in red there, if we block that feed there off, we don't increase the pressure in here, because it's the same chamber, this side of the pump. It's all the same. If I blow through there, it'll come out here. It's a bigger hole, yes, so the flow will increase, but the pressure will remain the same. The same pressure, 8 psi in here as there is in here, but there's just more of it in here at 8 psi. If you get the if you follow with that. I mean, I'm sure hopefully you are doing. So again, by blocking that off, we're not increasing the pressure here. All it's doing, it will balance out, because it's set mechanically to produce X amount of oil in each stroke, each rotation. So if we're blocking it off here, if we blocked all of it off, for instance, it would all go down this way, wouldn't it? You know, so we're now going to take it from here and block it off. And as I've said before, some engines do this because it's just sort of geographic locations of the oilways and interference with other things, etc. So that's what they do. As I said, Motor Guzzi have done this for years, where they've sucked it up essentially, pressurised out in two different directions from the oil pump, and some of it goes to the filter and some of it goes straight to the crank on the Guzzis. Yeah, so, but ultimately that oil at all times is being filtered. So just not at the point. So there's no, you get this, people on this big like, well, it's an unfiltered supply. Well, it is, and yeah, I get the point that if it drew in through that pickup and there was a bits of metal or whatever in it, and then it sent it straight out that way to the cams, that's really bad. I get it. I completely get that. There is also a strainer down here. We do have a strainer on here that's actually really small holes in the strainer. So we do have a point of contact with the oil with the strainer. So we are protected to a degree. So anyway, moving on. So we've now established that if we block this off, which the engine behind me has been blocked off, we do not increase the pressure to the gearbox shafts and the clutch bushrod, etc. We do not increase the pressure. It balances out because it's one chamber. So obviously now we've got more flow. We've got a bit more. Let's say we've got bad boys flow here. We've now got that flowing down here now. The flow down here has actually increased. Okay, down here and into the filter. So at the point now that becomes the argument, if you want to say the argument, is on the engine behind me, I have a sandwich plate which is here. Now, in fact, before we get to that, so we're going to follow this through now. We're blocked off here. As I've said, we're still feeding our shafts with 80 psi and the back of the clutch. We're also now a slight increase in oil flow, not pressure, flow at this side. Pressure is maintained by this oil pressure relief valve. Okay, here. So through the filter and then into the main oil gallery. We looked at this oil gallery in the first few videos. Comes down into a round chamber that there's a plug on the end, and then all the drillings in the crankcases go down into it. So we're going to follow it, up it goes into the crank. There's 4 mains and 4 big ends. There's an awful lot of oil flowing just to 4 mains and 4 big ends, and obviously a bit of splash feed around the pistons. So we've now got, that's all through the filter, it just does the crank, it just feeds the crank, that's it. But remember now, we've got a bit more, because we've blocked it off. So our bit more now is on our engine behind me. Where do I do it? Let's do 2 points for diagrams. On our sandwich plate, we've now got a point where we've got an oil line now that comes round onto there, and we've got another oil line that comes round onto there. These points here are the same as being fed from here, except they're slightly bigger bore. Back to the dynamics of hydraulic flow. The pressure, there's two sides to this. What I was going to say there is the pressure hasn't decreased because what we've robbed from here we've put into here and we're using it here now. A take off here, but then you would say, well, what was the point of all of it anyway if it's just the same? It is just the same, but it isn't. What we've got is 2 separate ones now. Instead of that bore teeing into 2, so we're now, whatever's in there, flow rate, not pressure, flow rate, we've halved it there to there. Half of it is in there, half of it in there. If it's going down there at 100 mile an hour, it's going there at 50 mile an hour and there at 50 mile an hour, if you get the analogy. Okay? So now, what we robbed from here and has increased into this line, we're now utilising here. But the eagle-eyed ones of you will have noticed it's in the pre-filter stage, so it's just the same here and here. It hasn't been filtered because it's on the way through the filter that we tee off. So it's pre-filter, so it's just the same at pre-filter. The only filtered oil is this that's going through to the crank here. Now what's actually happened is we will have reduced some of the flow, okay, to the crank, not the pressure, the actual flow. Remember, it's all been checked by this oil pressure relief valve. Now I think this oil pressure relief valve will open very early. I think it'll be somewhere in, I don't know, 3,000–4,000 RPM that will be open. So basically what I'm trying to say is this will be making a lot more pressure and flow than what the engine actually needs. It's over and above what the engine needs, and it's controlled by this oil pressure relief valve. That's generally the case anyway. Either way, what I'm going to do is, on the crankcases, there's a little oil pressure, here it is, that looks at this. Well, it actually looks at crank oil pressure, but you get the drift. It's looking at, so outside the oil pressure light switch, I'm going to remove that and I'm going to put a scope. Well, I'm going to put an oil pressure gauge in to start with, in here, when we fire it up. For my own, peace of mind as well, that what we've got, I mean, when you look at the bore size here, and then you look at the bore size going to the, if you added them all up just at atmospheric pressure, these are tiny little oil ways to here, and this is pressure, a big bore pressurized at 80 psi. I think there's more. My feeling is there's more flow here, and which is why we have one of these pressure relief valves, because it creates more than we actually need, because we need that at low rev. But the physics of the situation say if we rev it to 10,000 revs, we're going to have too much. So we need to find a way of governing it. If it was just fixed at one point, we'd only have about 8 psi down here to reach 80 revs. That's kind of the way of thinking about it. If you get what I'm trying to say. So anyway, that's my feeling. We've got two new oil lines coming out there now, from there to there, and we've blocked it off here. As I've said, what we've stopped flowing around there has actually increased in here anyway. Now, I think if we just had one line and we split it to the two, it would be the same. It would be the same. It's just, it's taking it from there rather than there. It would be the same. The fact that we've added two lines means on the oil line, we've got two of these in essence. Okay? We've got two of these oil lines in essence. So, would that, just by adding one more of those oil lines, because that's all we've actually done, if you get what I'm saying, if I can't wipe it out, but if I just had one of them and it teed to there, it's exactly the same as having that going to the two of them. So all we've actually increased is a second pipe. A second pipe of a 5mm bore. Now if it was open, you would bleed off loads of pressure, but remember it's pressurising against small holes in the valve gear, so it's still going to build the pressure up in the line, as is that. But the feeling is, before, the flow wasn't there enough. Even though it was still at 80 psi, there wasn't enough of it at 80 psi to do the cams, which is why they started to run dry. Is that the right word? Dry. It started to run. There just wasn't the lubricant there in sufficient quantities. So that's my take on it. That's the way I see it, and I hope you kind of follow it. And I think the proof's going to be in the pudding. When I finally get it back in the bike and we fire it up, The only thing I regret is, and maybe I can still do it, is the fact that I didn't take oil pressure readings here with the existing, from the banjo, or bad boy, from the banjo to the pipes. I didn't take an oil pressure reading at the crank then. I suppose I could still do it, it just means a lot of carbs off, and I think in essence what I need to know is that at any one time this crank is getting above, it's got to be above 20 psi, and as long as that crank never drops below 20 psi ever, hot, cold, any part of the rev range, never drops. I'm talking about idle here, I don't want it at 20 psi 8,000 revs, but I think as at idle it never drops. You know, and we can look at it at 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6,000 revs, and we can, like I say, we can put the gauge on and take measurements and have a look at what we get. We will also on the scope see a rise in oil pressure when we've got the pressure transducer in here. We will also see a rise in oil pressure moving with the engine RPM, but what we'll see then is as the engine revs increase, we'll see it just flat line, which will be where this is opened. And as the engine revs come back down, the flat line will just go along until the flat line reduces. So in essence what we will have, let's just see how I've got enough room on here. Right, on this oscilloscope, it should, excuse the drawings, but on the oscilloscope as a rising graph with RPM, it should increase with RPM and pressure. And as the RPM increases, it should not just keep linear going up. Had it not got that in it, it would. Okay, but because they've all got an oil pressure relief valve, at some point in the RPM, the pressure relief valve will lift off its seat and maintain a set oil pressure, and we will then get a flat line. The pressure over, even though the RPM is going up, the pressure will stay the same until the revs drop back down again, and then the pressure will drop back down with the RPM again, if you get me. It's that that's controlling the whole shebang, as they say. So what we'll do, on that note, with that, we'll I think the proof's in the pudding, isn't it? It's get it back in the bike. And what I did do is I put a bit of oil in, even though the clutch cover was off. I put a bit of oil in because you can actually get a good amount of oil in the sump with it being deeper than the clutch cover. And I actually took the chain off. You can actually, just behind the clutch, you can just get the chain drive to the oil pump off. And I actually put a 13, well, it was actually a 1/2 inch deep socket on the shaft where the sprocket went. Put my wheel brace, you know, the windy, wobbly wheel brace, okay, on a deep 1/2 inch socket that sort of just grabbed the shaft, turned it, even though the engine wasn't running, and the flow up our new oil lines, you could see it actually coming out the holes in the cans. And that was just at, you know, and we're not telling me that the size of the hole through there and the size of these two little holes here, that we were bleeding everything off here to go up there. No. What it was doing, because you could actually hear it coming out at the big ends and the mains, even though the engine was static and it was just me turning it by hand, you could actually see the flow was increased. So providing we can build pressure, that's fluid against a pressurized fluid coming out of this chamber here against a smaller orifice, that means that you'll get a pressure build up. A bottleneck, in essence. Anyway, it's going to be good fun, and it's going to be informative, and it's going to be definitive, because there's so much myths and whatever about this, about the oil system, that for one, all I wanted to do is, you know, nobody's trying to be a smart ass or anything like that. All I wanted to do is, it's my bike. I've seen these mods on the HRC bikes. I know that there's a problem with the with the oil system up to the cams. It really is very feeble when you look at that. I mean, it's like giving the cams some oil as a, oh yeah, don't forget them boys. Oh, my neck, I forgot about that. Chuffing, oh yeah, I forgot about them. You know, the cams have kind of had the real raw deal out of the, you know, and that there is the failing. Now you can drill the banjo bolt out, and in mine, somebody asked me about that. for a while I did run the banjo bolt drilled out for a while. There it is, you can see the bigger hole in the banjo bolt. I did run that, okay, I did run that, but do you know what, it's so small in that originally. When you take that banjo bolt out the back above the gearbox on that oil line, you take that banjo bolt out, you'll be amazed at the size of that hole in there. So that was the first mod I did. I did that quite a while ago. I did that when I first got the bike and sort of first read about it. It's a very quick and simple mod. You can increase the supply up here a little bit, but when I took this time, we took it to bits this time. You know, there's areas in there, I mean, they're not worn, but there's areas in there you think you could just, you just think they could do with a bit more oil in here. You know, when something's been running and you strip it down and you just think, bloody hell, it's either got good drainage or, look, everyone knows there's an issue with it, okay, so, and the HRC bikes, like I say, look for it at the front of the engine. The only way, just on that note, look for it at the front of the engine, they've got the external oil pipes up to the cams. So, the only way on that note, for anyone who doesn't like the fact that it isn't actually filtered before it goes up to the cams, the only way you could do it is you need to get it off this chamber, off here. So, in the cases on the engine, when you look at it, into this chamber, actually, obviously externally, but in the cases is a little flat. Feel this engine, see? Under the clutch casing, let me take you and... Right, bear with me a minute. Right. Under the clutch here, under the clutch casing here, just behind that Allen bolt there, under the clutch casing there, you can feel like a square flat. Sorry, a round flat. Just imagine a banjo bolt on there. Well, that flat there is directly, cranks there, directly above, or underneath should I say, the drilling into the crank. Now, when I'd got no components in this engine whatsoever, I looked at, do I tap into that bit there? But then, like I say, you get all of them, oh, you're tapping into the crank's gallery, you're removing some of the oil from where the crank's getting. No, it's not. If you've stopped it round there, you've increased the flow into here. If you put the same pipe into there, there's no difference. You cannot pressurize a liquid. There is no shuttle valving or anything like that, or stepping in this circuit. All it's doing is, if there's 2 exits to the pump, 3 exits, 7 exits to the pump, it will balance out. There's only orifice size that dictates what goes more one way than it is the other way. The pressure is equal throughout. Okay, so with that I thought, do I do that or not? And it meant drilling up there into the oil gallery, removing that little plug that's behind here, drilling up into the oil gallery and taking it from there. But then, you know, I just thought, you know what, I'm going to do it this way. I'm going to do it this way anyway. That stage there is pre-filter, but the flow down these lines, they're only 5mm inside. They look big, they're only 5mm bore inside it. Well, you can see it there on the, you can actually see it there. It's only, I think it's 5mm, 4mm or whatever it is in there. All we've done by blocking it off back there, there's more flow coming into the filter, into this stage here. So all we've done is we've robbed it from there and put it in here. So if I only had one pipe coming out of here, there would be no difference, because we're just taking it from there rather than there. But the fact I've got 2 perhaps reduces a, that's only if the oil pump can't keep up, if you get what I'm saying. Once you drop to the point where the oil pressure relief valve shuts, then that's when there may be a reduction in flow, but that may only be around 1,000–2,000 RPM. Either way, what I'm going to do, where this oil pressure relief valve, oil pressure switch is here, I'm going to take this. The reason this is in at the minute is I'm just looking at mounting the fan trigger somewhere in the thermostat cover. on this. So welding this, changing this cover. Hate where they put it. This trigger down in the bottom radiator is just wrong. Anyway, I'm going to take this. I'm going to put an oil pressure gauge on here when we fire it up, and when we fire it up, and let's just see it, oil pressures. This is completely reversible. Just take it all off and put the oil line back on, the metal oil line back on. If it, you know, if it's, I think it's worth it. Somebody needs to do it. Hey, somebody gotta do it. So there's so much myths about it, so much discussion about it. Let's just do it. Okay, let's just do it and see what happens. What the hell could go wrong? Catch you in a bit.